Welcome. My name is Dahlia Habib Linson. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the head of academic engagement at the MFA, and I want to thank you for joining us for this session of Artist Student Curator, a program that has been in the works to draw in the perspectives of artists, students, and museum staff to reveal some of the critical questions, structures, and processes that underpin how museums operate, from some of the very critical questions, from how collections and exhibitions take place to how audiences become engaged and narratives get reinterpreted. If you've been with us, you'll know that our first session, explored how objects enter collections. Our second looked at how museum exhibitions prompt new ways of considering objects. And our session today concludes by opening up a conversation on how museums participate in, reinforce, and disrupt storytelling through objects and exhibitions. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Michelle Miller-Fisher, and take a sip of water.
My name, as Dahlia so kindly said, is Michelle Miller-Fisher. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Ronald C. and Anita L. Warnick Curator of Contemporary Decorative Arts here at the MFA. Although I'm not physically there now, we would like to acknowledge that the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, founded in 1870, stands on the historic homelands of the Massachusetts people, a site which has long served as a place of meeting and exchange among different nations. As a museum, we acknowledge the long history of the land we occupy today and seek ways to make Indigenous narratives more prominent in our galleries and programming. And as I am an individual and not an institution, I acknowledge that as a Scottish person who has immigrated here, I take up space on land and in a country that is not mine. And I actively engage in ways to respect and honor the histories, presence, and futures of its lands and its peoples. We can all learn more about the Massachusetts people who continue to be the stewards of the land upon which the MFA was built by visiting massachusettstribe.org. I want to also take care of a few housekeeping things before we begin the program. Portions of the program are going to be recorded and available as a recording later this spring. So please note when the recording is taking place, you're welcome to turn off your video and mute your audio in order not to be included, but the majority of the recording is only going to show the folks who are speaking or presenting at any time. Dahlia, back to you.
Thank you, Michelle. And I also want to let our audience know that a transcript and closed captions for this program are available through Rev for Zoom live captions. And you can enable those captions by going to the bottom of your Zoom toolbar and clicking the up arrow next to closed captions. For the purposes of our transcript, we're going to try really hard to say our names before we speak for the clarity of the transcript. And during this session, we invite your participation in the form of questions and comments that can be shared through the Zoom chat function or the raise hand function as well. We want to offer our deepest gratitude to Sophia Walter for her amazing support in so many ways, on so many levels, to organize today's program and the whole series amongst a whole range of other programs for the MFA. I also want to remind our audience that we are eager to get your feedback, both on this panel and other events and programs that we do at the museum. As we walk together through this digital landscape of new programming, we're eager to know how these programs are landing with our audiences, and your responses significantly help us develop programs for students and for all of our audiences. So I'm showing you here a sort of overview of our session for tonight. As you can see, we've got a lot of really terrific speakers. But before we get to that, I want to share that our topic is about narratives. And our guiding question for tonight is to think about how museums participate in and disrupt storytelling through works of art and exhibitions. As I mentioned earlier, it's part of a series that aims to connect students and educators to forums to think about how museums operate, to bring some transparency to these institutions, and to think about what's working well and what we might want to change in the future. It's also related to a fabulous upcoming exhibition called New Light, Encounters and Connections, that is co-curated by my colleague here, Michelle Miller-Fisher, that pairs 20 new acquisitions of the MFA's collections with works from across the MFA to provoke conversations between objects that span eras, media, and ideas. And we also want to explore how exhibitions such as New Light seek to recontextualize, reframe objects that have been decontextualized from their original contexts, to offer new ways of disrupting dominant narratives related to objects, exhibitions, and histories. So we have only an hour. We certainly can't cover everything, but we want to be sort of framing our conversation by the expertise of our speakers and the stories that they want to share, as well as the interests of those in the audience. We want to invite a very transparent conversation, so we welcome questions throughout. And we are eager to think through questions about how museums share stories, what stories have and haven't been told, what role does interpretation play, whose voice or voices does the museum convey, promote, center, and whose does it not, and how is that changing right now? What is the process through which interpretation in museums functions? How do museums engage outside perspectives? Who gets to make those decisions? So we're going to dive into a lot of these really terrific topics today with our wonderful panel of guests. And toward the end of our session, we welcome your feedback through the form of a survey. So you will receive a link to a survey that we invite you to complete at the end of our session today. And while my introduction of our speakers could potentially take us into the next day, given all of their amazing accomplishments and roles that they play in the community in various contexts, we are going to turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves. So LaKela, may I begin with you? Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what brings you to our conversation?
Absolutely, thank you. My name is LaKela Brown, and I am an artist and an educator. I'm joining you from Brooklyn in my studio currently, and I am I am joining you in this conversation because I will be a participating artist in an upcoming exhibition, but also I'm here to learn myself and also share some of my perspectives on museum experiences, both as a museum educator and also as a visitor.
Awesome, thank you.
And I use she, her pronouns.
Awesome, thank you, LaKela. And Tanais, may I ask you to share with us who you are and tell us a little bit about in the moment where you are, because it's very exciting, and tell us a little bit about your interest in joining us tonight.
Yeah, so I'm Tanais Garcia. I use she, her, and hers pronouns. I am currently at the airport on my way to Spain to visit my partner, and I'm so happy to be here. I am a student at Bunker Hill Community College. I will be graduating this May with an associate's in liberal arts and sociology. And for me, my purpose is to inform new ways for us to take better care of our communities. Why this invitation to speak here? This past spring, I completed an internship at the MFA in the Art of the Americas. And before I took the internship, I was progressing in my career and I sought out more artistic opportunities. And I kept wondering, if Boston attracts tremendous artistic talents, where are the influences of these talents of people of color? Where are the spaces for us to make an imprint in the artistic world? If we do not see others like us in powerful spaces, how can we imagine ourselves as worthy artists? And with my reflection, personally, I just felt that it was my duty to kind of be part of this conversation, listen to other people, and encourage other students to take the opportunity to get involved with the museum and also make an impact.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're so thrilled that you can join us tonight. May I welcome Catherine can't see you on my screen, Catherine, but would you mind going next?
Certainly. Hi, I'm Catherine Johnson-Roehr. I'm the Senior Interpretive Planner in the Department of Interpretation at the MFA. I've been in that position or at the MFA for 3.5 years. I was pleased to be asked to be part of this today because interpretation as a field, even though I'd been around museums for a very long time, I didn't even know it existed until I saw the announcement for the position that I'm in. So I'm always happy to talk about it because I hope other people, they may not know about it as well, and I want them to know if they're interested in getting into the museum field that that is a possibility, and it's a growing field and a very rewarding one. So I'm happy to talk about it today.
Thank you, and I know we'll have a lot of questions about it. So thank you for joining us. And Adam, may I ask you to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hi, I'm Adam Tessier. I'm the Barbara and Theodore Alfond Director of Interpretation at the MFA. I've been at the MFA for 15 years and 10 years in this role leading interpretation. I work very closely with Catherine, and my mind is blown that it's been 3.5 years since you've been in that role, Catherine. It's amazing. And I'm excited to speak today. I'm excited to listen today above all. But I'm excited to speak today very briefly about some of the directions interpretation is moving at the MFA.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our speakers for joining us. And it's my pleasure to turn it over to Michelle.
Thank you so much, Dahlia. So it's wonderful to be here and to be here with you, LaKela. Thank you so much for your time. I have to say, I absolutely love your work. I'm indebted to my wonderful former colleague, Achille, who's now my former colleague. We used to work at MoMA together. He used to be in the department of the MFA. I've given him up to the Met because, he's going to do amazing things there as well. But he was the person who first showed me your work and was the person who welcomed it and shepherded it into the MFA's collection. We'll look at that work in particular in a moment, because that's actually going to be on display as part of New Light when that opens up on July 3rd. But I wonder, just for anyone who's on the call this evening who doesn't know your work yet, there's some images that we have up on the slides. Would you mind just giving a very brief overview of your practice and what we might be looking at in these slides?
Sure. So in these two slides, these two images are from my very first show from 56 Henry, which is the gallery that represents me in New York City. And what you're looking at essentially are, I call them sculpture reliefs. And there's some images that may be a little bit ambiguous. So the image on the left, for anyone who is familiar with like hip hop culture from the 80s and 90s and beyond, they may recognize the circular shapes as a kind of earring that was popularized by groups like Salt and Pepper and rappers like MC Lyte or Queen Latifah. It's a style of earring called a door knocker earring, and it's worn as a kind of adornment and like very closely associated with hip hop culture. And then in that also included, sometimes, I don't know, these things don't like translate through photos, but the other shapes there are bird heads, and specifically they are chicken heads. And chicken head is a word. It's a term that is used and often towards a person, a kind of person that may wear this kind of earring. And those chicken heads are cast from like an actual chicken head that I like made a copy of when I was a line cook. And I had made this mold years before, and when I started making this work, it occurred to me that like it paired well with this work. And then on the right side is a composition made with ropes to resemble rope chains, which are also and often worn with their door knocker earrings. So these are plaster reliefs. They are wall mounted, they are reliefs. And these two works were featured in my solo show at 56 Henry. I could say more, but.
Oh, that's absolutely perfect.
Okay.
I kind of want to ask, it's not a question on the list, and maybe we'll come back to it in the Q&A. I was also a line cook. And so there's a whole like biographic element there that I want to know more about, but we have a short amount of time, so I might come back to it in the Q&A. What I wanted to ask you about, because today we're looking at narratives, how they're shaped in museums, and you come into museums in multiple different ways as an artist whose work is on display, as a museum educator, as a professor and a teacher within university settings, and also as a visitor. And so you have a very multi-layered sort of approach to museum institutions. How do you shape or receive narratives in museums in any of those contexts? Can you maybe speak to one that's particularly compelling to you, if you would?
Sure. So as an educator, as a museum educator, I work with smaller children and children who often are not frequent visitors to museums. You know, it may not be the go-to pastime of their caregivers to take them to museums. And so we as the educators speak a lot to them about their experiences as museum goers. And something that I'm always trying to communicate to these young students is that they have a right to be there, and that, and just also to validate any feelings that like maybe they feel it could be unwelcoming. It could feel like an environment not for them. And so something I'm always trying to instill in them is like the right to be there, and, you know, as much as anyone else. And then also like explain why museums, having conversations with them, I should say, about why museums exist and like how we can engage. And maybe like, I don't know, it's funny talking to little kids because they ask the most interesting questions. And so that's something I think about as an art educator, is how to introduce and help these students engage, and think about how I engage as well. And I think about that as a visitor as well. Like, do I feel welcome here? What is this programming serving? What is the point? Who is it speaking to? What is it speaking about? So for me, it's a lot of questions and seeking.
I think that chimes really well. I remember the first time when I first came to a US museum, and there are many ways to be a museum educator and to teach within galleries. But when I was 22, I was introduced to the inquiry method, and the very first thing I was introduced to was the idea of asking a question. And the very first question I was told to ask anyone is, what do you see? And it immediately became apparent that it was completely valid for whatever their life experience might be, or whatever they did really see, to part of that conversation. And so I think, yeah, that notion of just opening up questions, so people of all ages, and especially, as you say, younger people, can bring what they see, what they think, what they feel, you know, in the context of the works that they're looking at, but also in context of the space as well, to that particular moment. When you're working as an educator in museums, and when you're coming in as an artist, when your work's on display, or you're going to see other exhibitions or collections, what excites you the most about narratives? Is there a specific example, even in terms of where you've gone into a museum space and thought, that nails it, like I'm so excited to see this particular narrative being propagated here? Conversely, are there experiences that have been deeply frustrating?
Yes. Yeah, that's a good question. I am often interested in the way that people can use museum spaces and sort of deconstruct the white cube. I am interested in people, you know, just diverse perspectives in general. And something that I find frustrating sometimes is the lack of like other perspectives, the absence of that, but also I don't know, like I said, one of the things I'm like concerned about always is like accessibility, the language, but also the, you know, issues of accessibility, and, you know, just wondering if people are considering their communities, the communities who they serve, and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that has become, certainly over my lifetime of working in museums over the last 15 years, an increasing consideration, but one that is really difficult to meet in many ways, I think, because of the ways that often the ways, I think, being very blunt, decision making happens in museums, right? Because museums purportedly serve their communities, but often it is not always the communities that help with decision making in museum models. And there's a desire to meet those two somehow, or to join those two up more in the contemporary museum, but the governance structures are maybe not quite there yet, or the routes or the channels are still being built. Sometimes they're tested out and they work really well. In other ways, it's a real abject failure. And so I think at the heart of those particular conversations, I often see, though, when they're successful, that it is both artists and educators who are really helping to form those chains and those projects. I want to, and Sophie, if you wouldn't mind just advancing the slides, I want to be able to get to the work that LaKela is going to have on display as part of New Light. And so you're seeing, as we're looking through these slides, just here other examples of your work, LaKela. This one's going to be on display as part of New Light, and it's actually going to be paired with, as Dahlia said, 2021 now, actually, we've added one grouping, but 21 works that are new to the collection are going to be connected to either a pair or a grouping of works that come from across the museum's collections, most of which have not been seen ever before, because they came into the collection, then went straight into storage. And so your work is being paired with a fragment from the ancient Egyptian collection. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how, if that seems like the right affinity for your work.
Yes, I 100% agree. And whoever, made that decision or proposed that object understood something about what I was getting at. So when I first started making this work, even from the sort of rudimentary experiments that I was doing that led to this body of work, I was I was visiting the Met, speaking of museum visit, and this is something, I do periodically as a kind of, refreshing. I don't know, I find it energizing and affirming to visit places like the Met. And I was walking through the Egyptian wing and looking at these fragments, and then also walking through the Roman and Greek sections. And I was looking at, these sunken reliefs and the way they're laid out, and but also looking at the coins in the Roman and Greek area. And something just kind of happened in my brain where I started thinking about the ubiquity of Roman design and Grecian design in our architecture. When I walk around, I'm often looking at the facades of buildings. And I have a real issue with ubiquity and the way it sort of flattens things, and we stop asking questions because it's just there and we take for granted that it's there. Mm-hmm. And so I was just thinking to myself, and then also I am African-American, and I'm saying it specifically that way. Normally I just say I'm Black, but I'm saying I'm African-American specifically to point to the history of my heritage, which is to say, I think of African-American culture contemporarily as kind of a second growth culture, in that we kind of we had our original culture stolen, and we kind of had to create our new culture. Mm-hmm. And so we don't have that sort of original culture to point to. And so in that, I was thinking about how could, what is an image that could represent me? So if we think of specific things as representing a country or a person or a culture, what are some things that could represent my intersecting identities, both as a Black person and as a woman identified person? And so I took these objects, these door knocker earrings, as something that I was thinking, now this is an object that if somebody found this, they might say, okay, this object belonged to a Black woman, right? And so it kind of became the basis of a new subject. And then also speaking of my intersecting identities, I am also a person who went to art school, studied Western art, and a lot of like traditionally Western materials and processes of sculpture. And so I wanted to think about how I could merge that aspect of my identity with my art practice, right? As a traditionally Western educated art student. And so I'm using the materials, plasters is a material that is associated with a very specific kind of materials and processes. It has its own history. And then for me and for many other people who share, and participate in this culture, they will recognize these objects as, being of a particular moment and time. And so that is how I sort of came to these objects. And, and I feel like I understand that whoever, some of the images are specifically taking, are an appropriation of Egyptian imagery. For example, in this piece, the 3 pharaoh heads, and then they are smaller and maybe harder to like, maybe they're not as legible in this image, but the smaller indentations that people are seeing in the surface are also Nefertiti heads. Queen Nefertiti being, an Egyptian queen. But like I said, these images were appropriated and used in the 80s and 90s, and became a part of like the visuals of hip hop culture, a part of the adornments and things like that. So whoever made that decision, I feel like they understood they understood that much.
It was Larry, who is our amazing curator of ancient Egyptian art, and of course, Akili. And there's so much more to be said. Akili has been thinking through artists' work or with artists' works that reclaim Egypt in some ways in his term. And I think you do that both through the imagery, the icons that you're using here. When I think of plaster as well in the MFA, the Met, other museums like that, I think of the history of plaster casts. And again, as you say, that very specific sort of Western art academy training. And so reclamation not only here of the iconography, but also of that particular materiality of plaster. As you say, it has a really specific history within Western art museums and within art museums like the Met or like the MFA too. There's some great questions in the chat about accessibility, and I think we're going to hold them for the Q&A. So
yeah, I noticed. Yes, I was like, I see you.
I don't want to ignore them, but I know we should keep to time because we have some other presenters. So we will hand over to Dahlia, and if you have questions in the chat, we will come back to LaKela for them in our Q&A, so we won't forget. Thank you so much, LaKela, and I hand back to Dahlia.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, LaKela. That was really exciting and a lot to get into. And I'm delighted to turn it over to Tanais and to say again, thank you for joining us. And this slide so beautifully demonstrates so much of who you are. So I'm glad that you put it together here. And I wonder if we could go to the next one, Tanais. And I've had the real pleasure of getting to know you over the last many months now in your internship at the MFA. And as you mentioned, you are part of the Art of the Americas department, and you were asked to come in and do something in an internship that was mostly remote, although you did come into the museum for a few sessions more, I think, as the internship progressed. And your task was one that I think is really fascinating and that has been so important in us learning from you, which was to go through all 4 floors of the Art of the Americas wing and to share your perspectives. And you did such a beautiful job of taking both a very critical and also very informed lens to this work. And I wonder if you could share with us a little bit about, from your point of view, through your internship, what sort of was made known to you, or what was revealed in this process about how museums tell stories in the work that you did.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. You really highlighted a lot of the work that I was doing. I think that before I entered my internship and entered into being part of the museum, I never really thought about the storytelling or how art gets put up in a museum, who makes these decisions. And throughout my internship, I noticed that there are multiple steps to how a gallery or how a department sets up each floor. And how long it takes. Like sometimes it could take up to like 10 years to curate a gallery. And that to me was just fascinating. You know, there's the curation of the space. Like what story are you telling? Whose story are you telling? Like how and who in the department is going to portray it? What teams do you need to work with? And is, when everything is said and finally done, is that really conveyed to the visitors? And it all comes down to perspective. And I think as art, it's so subjective that it just depends on who is telling the story. And it takes a lot of people to really put together a story to be able to tell the viewers what their point of view is. Sorry, I'm the
No,
background
it's
is
okay.
just distracted me a little bit.
If it's okay, I might just go to the next slide here. And, you know, thinking through that notion of sort of what you learned along the way, right? And I think that there are a lot of really interesting surprises. And I know that in the conversations that you and I have had over the last few months, I know that you've learned a lot, and so have I, just from understanding how you've encountered these spaces. So I wonder if you could share with us, when you were thinking through you know, the process of going through these galleries, and you're talking about this, you know, sort of this process of being sort of surprised at sometimes how long it takes to design exhibitions or gallery displays, and how many decisions are part of this process. If, as you reflect on it, I wonder if you could share with us, you know, what seemed to you most exciting about that process?
Yeah, of course. So, as a woman of color, you know, Black, Indigenous, of European descent, particularly I am Dominican and Mexican, I am among those unheard and unrepresented voices throughout the galleries. So for me to bring a lived perspective on how to genuinely curate the voices and stories of those unrepresented artists, and being able to engage with my department and share my point of view, and being able to like simulate proof of thought and conversation that would then turn into action, just really got me excited. And I want to, beyond my internship, continue to be a part of maybe the MFA, but the museum world in general.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I know that as your internship got underway, just as things started to sort of gain momentum, it was time to end. And so I think that it was really a terrific opportunity that we were able to extend the internship so that you could get deeper into the work. And I know that as you and I had conversations about this, that as you were preparing to give a presentation to the department that you were a part of, we were thinking a lot about what aspects of museum displays and interpretation, you know, sort of the shorthand that we use around storytelling, what seemed less clear to you or sort of more opaque. And so I wonder if you could share that with our group today.
Yeah, so in my department, like mentioned before, in the Art of the Americas, I think the question is of like where to move forward, or like what do we do now? The department hasn't been touched in about like 10 years. So the question of it's a very complicated question, but as the museum stands now, it's from the point of view of a wealthy white man's perspective. So it's how do we carefully go about integrating more diversity, whose stories we're telling, who's curating these portraits or works of art that we're going to carefully place to tell a story historically accurate, being inclusive for our visitors to be able to identify themselves. I think it was a little hard for us to kind of identify like where the starting point was, but we did know that there was like a clear lack of diversity in the stories that were being told throughout the museum.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I learned in listening to your really terrific presentation to your department was that I think in the museum, we think often about the sort of notion of the need to change on a macro level. And I think what you did so poignantly in your research of the galleries was you actually went not just floor by floor, but actually sort of gallery by gallery, object by object. You look so carefully at the labels, the arrangement of objects together. And I think that very careful examination is one that I think we often don't give enough time for, both as museum educators and colleagues, but also to our audiences. And so we certainly learned so much from that process. And I wonder, as you reflect back on the work that you did in the galleries that was so painstaking and so carefully done, what are some of the things that you wish were different, either about, maybe how we've talked a little bit about this, sort of how those objects are organized, or sort of the lens with which those objects and the stories around them are shaped. But what's something, aside from maybe not having a remote internship, what's something that you wish was a little bit different, or could change moving forward?
Yeah, so actually the Rome part of it wasn't a challenge for me, because I learned a lot through that. But I guess throughout the whole process of the museum, I wish that it did not take 10 years and a new staff and department to notice the lack of the colorful reality and the rich stories throughout the Americas. And this hemisphere's arts cannot be dominated by the Northern America or the US culture. But I am very grateful to be part of the museum at this point in time, when we are thinking about curating a more forward thinking storytelling.
It's really terrific. And I think as you've talked about, and of course we can, if you have any thoughts on this slide, I'd love to hear them. And maybe if you could, through this slide, share with us a little bit about what you think, what you've learned really about that process of interpretation in museums. Something that, as you said, you came into the institution not really having that grasp, like so many, myself included, not having grown up going to museums, but really that sort of apparatus of storytelling and narratives that are constructed through objects, through text, through labels. What do you think you've learned about the process of interpretation through that experience that you've had?
Yeah, I think with my supervisor, we had multiple conversations of what a good starting point would be. And it was a really tough conversation for us. It's tougher than it seems to be able to create a seamless story, attempting to connect all these objects, peoples, and places and events. But it's about being able to have that conversation, those tough conversations, and pushing the boundaries and just getting the work done. Art is always going to be interpreted differently by whoever is viewing it, and that is just something we have to accept. But by being able to have these open and challenging conversations, it can always be changed, and we can always move forward.
It's really terrific. Thank you. And that's exactly why we are so thrilled to have this conversation tonight, because I think that helps to move us in some directions that, oftentimes we talk about, but I think this really can activate a kind of vehicle of forward-looking motion and collaboration that we can all benefit from. So Tanais, we're so grateful that you joined us from the airport and had so many terrific thoughts to share about your experience, about the museum. And so I'm so thrilled to have your perspective, and we hope that you can stay on with us for as long as you can before you board your flight for our Q&A session. And I think there may be some questions and answers that we can get into. But before we do that, I'm thrilled to turn it back over to my colleague, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Tanais and Dahlia. I really appreciate it. And Tanais, your voice is exactly what is needed to counter some of the perspectives people don't understand in terms of why folks may not always feel particularly welcome in museums. So thank you for offering that this evening. That's precisely why we're here. I'm super excited to be joined by two of my really fantastic colleagues, folks that I work with very, very closely, particularly Catherine, actually, who is the interpretive lead for the New Light exhibition. So Catherine and Adam, thank you for spending time with us. Catherine, I'm going to start with some questions for you, if I may. You really neatly pointed out, actually, and you're right, I didn't know interpretation existed as a discipline within museums until a long time after I knew museums existed, and a long time after I knew different jobs existed within them. Can you just offer a sort of a 2-minute overview of what an interpreter does, what your job is on a day-to-day basis, and maybe how it's changed actually in the time that you've been at the MFA?
Certainly. When I started in the position, I understood that I would be reading text, proofreading. I don't usually write the original text. Usually it's sent to me by one or more curators who are organizing a show. And when it comes down to the wire, before all of this text goes on the wall, we really, go over it over and over and over it again to make sure we try to make sure we've caught every typo and we're being grammatically correct and all that. But I quickly learned that there's much more to this, to being in interpretation than what finally ends up on the wall. We actually start out right after an exhibition is approved. There'll be a content team that gathers with interpretation and curators and other people who might be involved in organizing a show, the designers. So the idea is that as we all move along, as the show evolves, we're all on the same page and we're all having input, which is really a wonderful group effort to produce a show. Whereas I had thought early on when I was taking a museum studies class that it would be more of, the solo curator, that it would be, their show. And it really is, as they say, it takes a village.
Absolutely, it does. And it's good that it does too, because I think that invites in multiple staff perspectives, and that maybe sort of is a reciprocal way of making, in terms of then inviting multiple visitor perspectives. Can you talk a little bit about the slides that are on the screen, Catherine? Because you brought some along, and I think they're really helpful also in terms of, offering people an overview of what it is that you do in an interpretation department.
Yes, I chose this exhibition in part because it's currently on view at the MFA. So if any of you are in Boston or nearby, this exhibition is up through January of next year. We actually started working on it a couple of years ago. It was due to open around the time that the pandemic shut everything down. And that is, we hope that we usually have, at least a year to work on an exhibition. It takes a while for it to gel. This one was, it's titled Collecting Stories because it's one of 3 exhibitions, all with that initial title, that are aimed at bringing out items from the permanent collection at the MFA that haven't really been seen before or seen very often. This one talks about folk art, but the curators who worked on this show wanted to make it clear that folk art is something that's a concept that's really been invented. As you can tell from the title, that people who make this art don't necessarily see themselves as folk artists, that they are artists and that what they produce is art. And it's museums and curators and gallery owners and dealers who have, in the 20th century, early 20th century, actually created this concept of folk art. What we wanted to do was focus on a collection at the MFA by Maxim Karalik. He was a Russian emigre who was, he and his wife were incredible donors to the museum. They donated a great deal of American art, many American paintings. But shortly after his wife died, Maxim Karalik discovered these works often by unknown artists that he found fascinating. So he convinced, it took some doing, but he convinced the curators at the museum that this was art that was worth giving serious attention to, that was worth collecting. It helped that he was willing to purchase it and donate it to the museum, but it's never really been part of the main galleries. It's right now there is a folk art gallery, but much of the art, especially the works on paper that are very fragile and light sensitive, most of those have just been in storage for a very long time. So this exhibition was designed to bring those pieces out and to also explore this idea of whether we need the category of folk art. Interpretation is clearly very essential for that goal, because it could have been just a gallery of really wonderful art. But we really wanted to get people thinking about this idea of do we need to separate this art? Is that fair to the art to treat it that way? The list I put on the screen here is just to give you kind of a nuts and bolts look at what we do when we're coming to the time to put the exhibition together. We need basic things like a title, an introductory panel, a chat, which is what you see in the photograph here in the center of the wall, which is a text, preferably 2 paragraphs that relates to a group of objects. And then an individual label for usually for one piece that explains why that particular piece is of interest. And not in every exhibition, but we also may find it helpful to have maps, to have timelines, a quote from an artist or another person, possibly digital media, video. Now we're using QR codes more and more, now that they're easier to use, so that you can access a website, for example, and get more content that way. There may be an interactive screen where you can explore and get more than what we could put on the wall. And now we have the MFA mobile app that we're actually inviting people to use their own smartphones to get additional content that way. So this particular show it's actually a fairly small show, so it doesn't involve all of that media, but we did decide to go with a video. And it's really quite a wonderful video from about 1960 featuring the collector Maxim Karalik, talking about these artworks and why he didn't care who the artist was. He said the curators wanted to know, so you bought this art for us, who made it? And he just didn't think that was important if, it was really the art that he found interesting.
Yeah.
So we allow visitors to get a taste of this fascinating person in the gallery. In other exhibitions, we may use a video monitor for interviews, for a music video, or whatever is appropriate. But the best thing about being able to have words on the wall is that we are able to go much deeper into content. We certainly want visitors to bring whatever they want to from an exhibition to relate directly to the art on the wall. But we like to provide text that would help them either understand the art or just give them some food for thought. In this case, we titled this chat "Labels Matter," because we wanted to acknowledge, even though the show is primarily work from the Karalik collection, which dates from the mid-20th century, it was not a perfect collection. It was not really that inclusive. This collector didn't acquire work by people of color. He did collect work by women and girls because they were producing some of these, like a sampler or a drawing, but there are definitely gaps. And we wanted to acknowledge that through text, and also acknowledge the fact that the museum has tried to rectify that over the last 60 years or so, and is actively collecting work by people of color, by Indigenous people, by more work by women. And what we see on the slide here are some of the works by artists that are maybe better known today as outsider or visionary artists. So we thought it was important for this exhibition to acknowledge that the art that was collected in the mid-20th century didn't represent the range of what we now call folk art.
Catherine, that was such a perfect overview of what you do in terms of interpretation on so many levels. And I think also personally, just a really great argument for why interpretation is such a crucial part of exhibition making. I have more questions for you, but because of time, I'm also really excited actually about Amy Travis's question in the chat, because there's a perfect segue into New Light and the ways in which both the folk art exhibition and the New Light exhibition are thinking about mixing things up, as she says. But just quickly before we transition into Q&A, Adam, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Table of Voices. It's a lot to fit into a minute or two, but it's such an important part.
Sure. I'm more than happy to give a minute on Table of Voices and just say how full I am hearing everybody come before me. My goodness. So Catherine gave an excellent expert overview of interpretive practice at the MFA. We are expanding and we're thinking in new ways as well. A thing that I spend a great deal of time thinking about in my role in interpretation is the fact that, and it's really interesting to me that museums and their galleries are as much about our moment and the world that we live in as they are about the moment that the art was made. You know, I'm thinking about ancient galleries, or, you know, when we put together an exhibition or a gallery, it's as much about ourselves and as much about our world as it is about the time period. And that's part of our job, right? Is to figure out how to create those connection points for our visitors to look at these works of art and to connect them to their own experiences, to figure out why they matter to them, why they mean to them, and how they resonate in their own worlds. Table of Voices is an initiative that was launched about 2 years ago by the MFA, funded by Joyce Lindy and the Lindy Family Foundation. And I'm showing you here a spread from an upcoming publication that we'll be putting out in the coming months that details the process. So I'll make sure to share it with Michelle, and she can share it widely if anybody's curious. At its heart, Table of Voices is an initiative that is meant to center and engage and center the expertise and experience of many individuals in the work that we do in creating content and interpretation for our galleries and for our exhibitions. How it works is by gathering. It works by using familiar structures like roundtables, focus groups, advisory committees, as well as some structures that are somewhat innovative. Working groups that travel with us for the life of a show, outside review, finding experts from other fields to look at all of the interpretation before it goes on the wall and give us advice from their perspectives. For example, for the Gender Bending Fashion exhibition, 2 years ago, we did that with members from Fenway Institute, the LGBTQ Health Center in town, Health Institute in town, Simmons College, a queer fashion historian, you know, just to name a few people. So at the end of the day, this is about bringing more voices into our work to understand our work differently, to understand our work better, and to increase not just representation and inclusion in the voices in our galleries, but to fundamentally change the way we think about how we create content and who has a stake in the stories that we tell and whose expertise matters and is required for the stories that we tell.
Thank you, Adam. That was a perfect summation. It was absolutely beautiful. I know that we have about 7 minutes left of our hour together, and so I'm going to invite everyone back together. And we have some fantastic questions in the chat. We invite any more that anyone would like to share with us. Dahlia, did you have one that you wanted to choose, or are you happy for me to choose one from the list?
I'm happy to have you choose. I have not seen the chat because I was sharing, so feel free
Fantastic.
to.
Okay, great. So I'll start with one, and then if there's another that you would like to choose. So I'm actually going to go to Amy's question. And I'd be interested to ask Catherine and Adam, because you have sort of a macro view in many ways of the exhibitions that are coming up at the MFA. I'm also happy to talk about New Light, but Amy's talking about the challenge that they find in visiting the MFA in particular, collecting things by time and place. There's a very taxonomic sort of 18th and 19th century way of setting art out in galleries. And they say, if I feel it forces a specific story, I wish things got mixed up more. Are there plans to mix things up a bit in any way to allow the serendipity of people's own experience as they encounter works in the galleries? I wonder if Catherine and Adam, you have specific thoughts. I'm also really happy to talk about New Light.
Well, we definitely want to shake things up. As Tanais noted, the American wing was set up a decade ago and really hasn't changed substantially since that time. So we're aware that it takes time to redo something like an entire gallery or wings of a museum, but that is something we are in the process of doing. Right now, we're renovating the Greek and Roman areas and really doing a lot of very different interpretation with that material than has been done with the past. And we're also working on our Dutch collection with the same goal of telling many news stories that we, even though we may be using some of the same artwork, they have different things to say.
I'd love to add that I think it's so, museums have this interesting quandary that history and art history don't align perfectly, right? And history and art history both are told by the people that have the platform to tell it. So I'm hearing in Amy's question also like a fundamental integral issue to history making and history telling in the form of, you know, museum practice as well. And so how to turn that on its head is an amazing quandary.
Yes, totally. And I think, I mean, part of the thing that fascinates me about working with museum collections and the questions that we are asking of them now and rethinking the ways in which we might acquire museum collections are often, not always, because there are lots of different types of museums, they're not homogenous institutions, but they are often derived from personal collections that are amassed by very wealthy people, and there are very few of them that then come together to form museum institutions. So as you say, Adam, these collections often reflect the taste, the collecting patterns, the reinforcement of certain statuses. And when they come together to form a museum institution, it's not that they don't also represent, you know, really fantastic artworks a lot of the time, or pinnacles of artistic achievement. But that is a fairly narrow lens with which to tell stories of visual culture, to put it mildly. And so when we're thinking about narratives in museums, the thing that really excites me today is to be able to think beyond wealth being a factor in being able to tell visual histories, and to think about wealth of knowledge, about wealth of culture, about reclamation of that wealth, so repatriation, reparation. And as a curator, those are the questions and the ideas that really excite me, because many contemporary artists, including LaKela, are leading the way in terms of those conversations.
Can I add one little thing, Michelle, that is, actually, no, I apologize. I'm going to save it.
Okay, that's perfect. Well, so it gives me the opportunity to also come to the chat. LaKela, did you want to address or think sort of nuance what you were talking about in terms of accessibility, or is there another question that was catching your eye?
Sure. Well, I saw a few things. I know we don't have much time, but actually I was really happy because you actually hit on some of the things that I was going to talk about in terms of accessibility. Before, when we were doing our sort of prep before we went live to make sure all of our technology and, you know, everything was going well, one of the things we talked about, I was talking about how, you know, it feels weird to point out a positive thing about like something that the pandemic brought about, but one of those things is accessibility. And in one form that is like accessibility to like be able to attend something like this, even if you're not in the right state or city, but also for people who physically may not be able to leave the house, or it's very difficult for them to leave the house. But also, so I was thinking physically about accessibility, right? Ramps, elevators, these kinds of things, but also something that you just hit on, which is wealth being a factor for who gets to say what is important. So I was also thinking, you know, and wealth in all kinds of ways, people who are able to accumulate collections, but also people, you know, who are able to go to art school. I was able to go to art school and like learn these things and have, you know, learn about gallery culture, and also understand systems and all of these things. These are all like, you know, forms of accessibility, and some of them may be physical limitations or monetary, but like, you know, general issues of accessibility. So I hope that answers the question, but I was thinking about accessibility on all fronts. I mean, and it's also interesting to be here with Catherine and Adam and hear them speak about like using language as a tool for accessibility, and really to think about that. So
yeah. And I love, thank you, LaKela, that was so perfect. I love what Janet said in the chat. Actually, a teacher of mine once said that every piece of art we look at is visible for us it's visible, and the work of three people, the person who made it, the person who used it or paid for it, so the patron, and then the person who brought it to this place where we see it, three angles of approach. And I really love that thought. And I want to affirm everything that you said about accessibility there, LaKela. I was lucky to grow up in a country, Scotland, where as a child of somebody who didn't even make it to the end of high school, I could go to school for free, and I could go to any museum that I wanted to for free. And so different forms of accessibility, different barriers in that country, but I'm always struck by the fact that for most US museums, you have to pay a not inconsequential amount of money to get into them. So there's a barrier to access right at the start. Dahlia, are there any other questions that you think we should look at, or are we at time?
You know, I do want to acknowledge that we are at time. And so for those of you who need to go on to your evening, thank you for joining us. But I do want to note that there's a question from Jillian, actually, who's a former intern at the MFA, and so delighted that she's with us tonight. And she asks a question about interpretation. So Adam and Catherine, I wonder if you could think a little bit about to what extent interpretation in your work, how you have to navigate around the work that you do in this notion of including voices and perspectives and really thinking beyond the traditional boundaries of museum work, and how that comes up against issues like institutional brand and standards.
First, it's so amazing to see Jillian's name pop up in the chat. Hello. It's so good to see your name and to hear your voice through text. I and Catherine can back me up on this. Like, I'm a big believer in making the rules fit the need. And of course, we have to work within like the big institutional brand standards and all of that. I think we went through a wonderful brand exercise fairly recently with the MFA that came out with some brand objectives that really are supportive of interpretation and supportive of the work, especially that we do in Table of Voices. But we also bend and break rules left and right, because I happen to believe there's no two works of art that are the same. There are no two artists that are the same, and there's certainly no two visitors are the same. The works of art only come to life in the eyes and the hearts of the people that come through the doors, and what it takes to get it across, we need to bend and break whatever rule it takes to get the message and the story to come across when we need to.
It's really, really important.
And I think that's good interpretive practice, and I'm going to say that right here.
Here you go. Absolutely. That sort of ways we can soften that often really imposing facade of a museum, right, is to think about ways in which the practices that we are here engaged in, and certainly looking forward in the future with the students that are joining us tonight and the educators, of ways that we can evolve that process along, and breaking rules is part of it. So thank you so much, Adam. And I know, let's see, so we've got wonderful.
Those are kind of how we got to where we are. Like, I think about that. Rules helped us get where we are, so breaking them help us get somewhere else.
That's right. And like we always say to students, you have to know the rules before you can break them, right?
Absolutely.
So I think we are out of time for tonight, and our wonderful colleague Sophia has put in a link to our upcoming events, as well as to a survey. We would love to get your feedback on this event and certainly others as well. So we invite you to complete that. And I want to extend my most sincere gratitude to all of our panelists and to my collaborator, Michelle Miller-Fisher, for helping me put this together, and to future conversations. It's always a good thing. We're always running out of time because there's so many great observations and questions. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.